Your menstrual cycle is much more than just when you have your period. A lot of people think it's just the days that you bleed, but in fact, your menstrual cycle is the day you start your period all the way until the day before your next period. So on average, you're looking at 25 to 35 days, depending on your age and depending on your unique cycle blueprint. But
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Female Empowered Podcast. I'm your host, Krista Gurka, and today we have another guest episode. I'm getting back to doing these in 2023, if this is when you're listening to it. And today I'm excited to have Leslie Draffin here. And I'm going to give her a little brief introduction, but like I always tell you guys, I'll let them introduce themselves because it's way better than me reading off of basically a cue card. So Leslie is an internationally certified menstrual cycle coach, microdosing practitioner, feminine embodiment mentor, and podcast host who is passionate about eradicating shame and fear around women's bodies, cycles, and psychedelics. So if you guys have listened to me lately, actually, I'm trying to think if I actually have mentioned it on the podcast, but I have been going down the plant medicine rabbit hole over the last 12 to 18 months. And I've become enamored with it. And like I've read almost every book imaginable about it. And I'm just fascinated with the experience. And so I'm really excited to have Leslie on. Primarily, I'm going to have her talk a little bit about how we as women can use our menstrual cycle for good versus evil. I have also read a lot about how we can really use our cycle to boost our productivity, know when we're more creative, et cetera, et cetera. And so I found it fascinating when Leslie reached out to me and I was like, I thought I'd bring this to all of my audience because I think it's really interesting information. So Leslie, would you be so kind as to tell us a little bit about who you are and who you serve and what it is exactly that you do?
Well, thank you so much for having me. You did a great job introducing me. So like you said, I am a menstrual cycle coach and a microdosing practitioner. And I usually work with conscious women and menstruators to help them awaken their authenticity and step into their power through cyclical living, psychedelic integration, and womb reconnection. Those three things are the things that have made the most impact in my life and in my healing. And so I know it can also be the things that help others as well.
It really is fascinating, and not to get us too off skew, but I'm actually reading a book right now that's called Emotional Inheritance. And it's really interesting about how sometimes trauma is passed down from generation to generation to generation. And we probably lost a few people already on this podcast that are like, yeah, click, not going down that rabbit hole. But if you're sticking around, I personally used to be someone that like poo-pooed all of this woo-woo, let's say. I really did. I was a very left-brain person. I was like, everything has to have science and evidence. And over the last, I would probably say 3 to 4 years, it's really enlightened. I've been very enlightened through my own therapy, and I've been very transparent about being in therapy. And I've just recently, I would say since COVID, really started researching a lot about plant medicine. And I have a colleague and friend here in Miami who is very much into it. And she was someone I reached out to when CBD was kind of on the market long ago. And she's now doing a variety of things very educationally with ketamine as well as psilocybin. And so it's just super, super fascinating to me. So I anytime I can have the conversation about it, I'm like, let's talk about it. But why don't we start with, I'd love to hear your origin story, or as much as you'd like to share. How did you come to be? This is definitely a niche that I would say is not mainstream. But so how did you come to like have this be what you're currently doing?
Oh my goodness. So I guess to start, I was raised in a very Christian Southern family where I didn't get a ton of education around my cycle. I lived in fear of my cycle because I was just convinced that I could get pregnant at the drop of a hat. Fear was a huge part of my life and a huge part of my sex life. And so I went on birth control at 18 and never learned about my cycle until 2020 rolled around and I decided to come off of the pill. I'd had my spiritual awakening the year before. I had felt this inner knowing that I was stifling my innate femininity by putting these synthetic hormones in my body. And so, kind of like you, I dove right down the rabbit hole, reading all the books, doing all the things, and talked with my then fiance about getting a vasectomy because we knew we didn't want to have children. But again, that fear of falling pregnant was so ingrained in me. And so I came off the pill in 2020 after 16 years in the midst of COVID, probably the worst time you possibly could choose to come off of the pill because that shit was wild, like in the outside world. And then, of course, in my inner world as well. And all hell broke loose. I got horrific mood swings, completely lost my libido, like we're newlyweds and I do not want to have sex. And then a few months later was diagnosed with PCOS. My hair started falling out. I got cystic acne and I was a TV news anchor. And so my appearance is a huge deal, right? So there was a huge knock to my self-confidence. But over the next 7 to 10 months, I did hundreds of hours of research, spent thousands and thousands of dollars to figure out what the fuck was going on, and finally was able to heal myself. Because of that whole process and that whole journey, I had really started to binge a lot of podcasts about I'm just a huge fan of is the Well Woman podcast by Gemma Lee. She is out of Australia. Gemma in 2021 unveils this cyclical school, the first internationally certified menstrual cycle academy. So I jumped in, got certified, and really over that 6 or 7 month period, started to uncover this whole knowing that, okay, this is what lights me up. TV news was not lighting me up anymore. I was what I didn't even know at that point, but I was experiencing severe burnout, stress, of course, anxiety. And so in 2022, I found plant medicine. I specifically work with psilocybin or magic mushrooms. And I got a microdosing coach to help me around blocks in my business and being open to receive pleasure. And then burnout still was really hitting me just like square in the face. So I took an extended leave of absence from work in June of 2022 and never went back to TV news. So I guess your question is, how did I get here? I got here because of that little inner knowing, I think in 2019, that like something isn't quite right. And it was just a series of events that kind of have led me to where I am now, cyclical living, uncovering the trauma that was in my womb, uncovering the trauma around my sex life and my past. And then finding magic mushrooms to help me with this thing I thought I really needed help with, right? Like being open to receive pleasure and being open to receive abundance in my business. But what I discovered is that the mushrooms don't always give you what you want. They give you what you need. And what I truly needed was to become open to receiving, like, period.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was the big lesson last year, is to stop white knuckling onto this life I thought I wanted for so long so that I could open my palm and receive what the universe wanted to give me. And mushrooms were, I think, the biggest tool in finally allowing me to step into my femininity and become someone who does allow and receive.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. I'm always fascinated by people's origin stories, and most people that I interview or come into contact with, it is very organic. It's kind of like, this is not the path I thought I was going to go down, and I just ended up this way. And one thing led to another thing, led to another thing, led to another thing. We do have a ton of pelvic health therapists that listen to this podcast, and PCOS is like a big, it's very, again, not mainstream, but more and more and more women specifically are talking about it, and they're being more vocal to their practitioners or their medical professionals to say, like, this is not normal. And this is, the cystic acne is really awful. And yeah, so it is, they say you can't receive with a closed fist. And so it is a learning, especially at least in American society. So I'd love to hear a little bit about what you learned in the menstrual cycle kind of academy, because I think that is really interesting to really, I'm a Gen X kid, so like I'm almost 50. So we definitely did not talk about any of that at that age for sure. I think my mom like gave me a book or something like what's happening to my body. And I was like, do we talk about this? Like nobody talked about it. I'm also from a very Catholic family. So same thing, like as soon as you get your period, it's, don't look at boys, don't talk to boys, careful, don't hold hands with boys.
Yeah.
But it definitely is a generational thing. Like we just didn't talk about it then. And this generation, I don't have girls, I have boys. So I don't have to have that exact conversation with them. Exact. But I'd be fascinated. I'd really love to hear like, can you actually first maybe go through the different stages of the cycle, even though it is mostly women that listen to this podcast, but I guarantee you that even women don't understand the difference, like in the stages of our actual cycle.
Of course. My husband is so well educated about this because he had to be. So I love that you have sons, because I think this conversation is important for women who maybe not understanding their own cycle, but for anyone out there. So your menstrual cycle is much more than just when you have your period. A lot of people think it's just the days that you bleed, but in fact, your menstrual cycle is the day you start your period all the way until the day before your next period. So on average, you're looking at 25 to 35 days, depending on your age and depending on your unique cycle blueprint. But you're always somewhere in your menstrual cycle. And so there are 4 phases within the cycle. The more medical terms are the follicular phase, the ovulatory phase, the luteal phase, and then the menstrual phase. But the way that I teach it, and the way I wish I had learned as a kid, is the inner seasons model. And so inner spring is the phase right after your period is over. When you start to feel like coming out of your shell again. Inner summer is when you ovulate, when you're super social, when you're hot AF, and you are just like ready to mingle. Inner fall is the luteal phase, which is also the longest phase. And then inner winter is when you have your bleed. And so those are sort of always cycling for you within your body. And so that's kind of the first thing to understand about the menstrual cycle, is that you have very distinct phases that are really governed by what's called the infradian rhythm. So the infradian rhythm is a unique biological clock that people with periods have, and it governs 6 biological functions. So brain, metabolism, immune system, microbiome, stress, and then the reproductive system. And what's fascinating is that this is a cycle and a biological clock that is as long as your cycle. So if your cycle is 28 days long, that's how long your infradian rhythm is. And basically the term infradian really just means something that's longer than a day. Circadian rhythm is what a lot of us have heard about, and that's how male hormones function. And that's what the world is set up for. The world is set up for male hormones. That's why we have a 9-to-5 job. That's why the deadlines are the way they are. But when we talk about the infradian rhythm and people with periods specifically, I like to think of the moon. The moon is very much a type of infradian rhythm, right? The way that it waxes and wanes across its 29.5-day cycle. And so we are very much like the moon, in that we wax and wane as well. Sometimes we've got a ton of energy, and sometimes we need more rest. Sometimes we are super focused, and sometimes our brains feel a bit scattered. And so it's understanding your own unique clock, the way that your body responds to the infradian rhythm, that really becomes this amazing tool we can use to just completely up-level our life.
Yeah, it really is fascinating. When I learned a little bit about, the difference in the cycles, and that, men basically go through that cycle in a 24-hour period, no pun intended, but yes. And then women do it. I mean, again, I'm going to say relatively 28 days or whatever the case may be. And you're absolutely right. So men cycle through that rhythm 24 hours, and most of our world is set up that way, right? And women cycle through it differently. But for me, when I started learning a little bit about this, and by no means am I even close to being any type of expert on this, but it was interesting to me when I could start to say in my business, if I was going to launch a new project, I was going to make sure to do it at a time that I was energetic and that I was social and I was comfortable being live on camera and things of that nature, right? In my creative type window versus in a time where I was like, I just want to be in my cocoon and recover, right? And so I think this is really fascinating. So can you talk a little bit about then if women are going to look at their cycle and do the things that they're most lit up about when that time period is for them?
Yeah. So the first thing I want to say is that your cycle is very unique to you. So the things that I'm going to talk about may not be typical for you. I have certainly had times in my own cycle where things that, are quote unquote supposed to happen weren't. For instance, like feeling really social during summer, I wasn't. And that could be a sign of some hormonal imbalances I have had, but it also is just life and stress and everything. So take all of this with a grain of salt. But generally, inner spring is the time when our brains are wired for new creative ideas. This is brainstorming session. Like, I love in my inner spring to set aside some time to just bullet point ideas, big, small, as crazy as possible, and just make lists. I'm not acting on those things. I'm just getting everything that's in my brain out on paper. And so big ideas, little ideas, all of the cool shit that you want to do in your business, that's most likely going to start coming to you in inner spring. Another thing about inner spring is this is a great time to learn new things. So if you have to learn a new automation for your business, if you have to learn a new set of software or new editing or, whatever, this is a really great time to learn new things because of the energy that's naturally rising in your body and your brain's capacity to learn new things. So inner spring is really great for freshness and newness. And just like spring, where we're kind of blossoming on the outside in the outer spring, that's very similar to what it would be like for you and your business when you're in inner spring. Now, inner summer is the shortest phase. It's usually 3 to 7 days, 3 to 6 days, depending on who you ask and depending on your cycle. This is when you're getting in front of the camera. You're filming content, you're negotiating contracts, you're going to networking events, you're interviewing people if you want to hire people. You're very outgoing, you're very magnetic. And if you are somebody who isn't a business owner, but you are in the corporate world, this is when you ask for a raise. Like if you want to get more money in your business, maximize inner summer, because there's just something about your charisma and your confidence and your ability to make words word. Words are good. In inner summer. I'm in inner summer right now.
And so you're saying 3 to 5 days, but this is the second, if we're going to go by the order, right? This is the second order of our phase, correct?
Yes. Yep. Yes. And whoever created these phases didn't really do us a solid when it's a little confusing if you think about it, because day one of your cycle is when you're in inner winter, but inner spring is technically your first cycle phase. Don't think too hard about it. There's no test at the end of this.
No.
But what's also important to know is that there's no hard out. So you don't suddenly think, oh, inner spring is over and now inner summer has begun. It bleeds into each other.
Yeah. No, I think what was helpful for me was when I learned that actually happens, right? I was like, oh, that makes sense. Cause I feel like there are times where I'm just like, yes, let's go. I have all these ideas. And then other times where I'm like, I don't really want to do anything today.
Yep.
And 100%. So then I was like, oh, it does correlate to my cycle, which is different than everyone. So again, it's not a perfect science. Everybody's different. And there's nothing wrong with you if you're feeling like that's not called to you. There's nothing wrong with it. This is just information to take with you as you wish. But when I started realizing that, and I could say, oh, I'm roughly in this time period, if I had something big, I mean, what's the harm going to happen if I'm like, okay, I'm going to do a big launch and this is a date I'm going to do it on. And if I'm off a couple days, or it's not going to be the end of the world, but if I'm on, it's just going to mean like I'm that much more on.
Oh yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Just because, like you said, you're outside of a cycle phase that might be the optimal time to do whatever task you need to do. When you take care of yourself and you're living in alignment with your cycle in other ways, you're going to be able to do whatever you need to do.
Yeah.
So, inner fall is the longest phase. It comes right after inner summer. This is when PMS can happen, and it gets a really bad rep. But for me, inner fall is my favorite season. This is when your progesterone rises. You can be very focused on the detailed tasks. So, let's say in inner spring, you came up with this idea to like have a launch in a couple of months. Inner fall would be when you'd really start to meticulously plan. All right, what can be my master class for this? What can be my, downline funnel for this? This is when you're getting out the spreadsheets and the bulletin board, and you're making the vision boards of like the how you're going to make it happen, because you're really able to focus on, those little details. When I was in TV news, my inner fall would be when I would edit all of my stories. And usually when I'd write them too, I would shoot them and set them up in spring and summer. But fall was when I would get down and do the dirty work. This is when you do your taxes. This is when you do your bookkeeping. And you may also find that this is when you naturally are way more organized, because it's like all the animals that are prepping for winter in fall outside. That's
Yeah.
you in inner fall.
Yeah.
You're like getting ready for your nest. So one thing that can come up in inner fall that would be like a cycle challenge is questioning all of the things. Like the inner critic really can come out in inner fall. And so just be aware of that. I don't like to make massive decisions about my life in inner fall because sometimes it's like I'm making them from a place of fear or scarcity, or, just feeling a little shitty. So while, yeah, you've got the big ideas in spring and maybe you make them more real in inner fall, inner winter, which is the final cycle phase, that's when big decisions can either be like cut off the chopping block or really elevated. Because for me, in the way that I believe, this is when we are closest to the divine. This is when we are channeling big ideas. People say sleep on it. I say bleed on it. If you have come up with an idea in your business, I say wait a full menstrual cycle so that you can have time to sit with that in a ritual or in ceremony or just in a journaling practice while you bleed, because you're really going to get a good hit on like what's going to work and what's not. Inner winter is also when you're really going to want to be inward, right? You're going to spend more time with yourself. If you've got, like you said, if you've planned something and your cycle kind of got messed up and all of a sudden you thought you were going to be inner summer, but your cycle came early and you're boom, inner winter for like a big launch, that's totally okay. I've certainly had that happen myself. And the best thing to do is just up your sleep, eat more food, good complex carbs, and make sure that you're taking time for yourself.
Yeah. And what about when women say, well, I'm not menstruating anymore, or I'm in perimenopause, or I'm in menopause, or I'm past menopause? Can you talk a little bit about what happens to the cycle when, or maybe somebody had a hysterectomy or any type of that condition?
Absolutely. So there's a couple of different things that happen with the different things that you mentioned. So let's start with perimenopause. That's when you're leading up to the end of your cycle. And perimenopause can last like 10 years. And so usually it's typical for cycles to become much longer. I've worked with women in their 50s who have seen cycles last between like 60 and 180 days. That's rough, right? What you can sometimes feel like in that part of your life is like a stagnation. And so I say for anyone who is at that point, who has reached menopause where they're no longer bleeding, you're post-menopause, when you want to still align with the principles of cyclical living, you look to the moon. The moon and the moon's energy has a massive impact on us, whether we want to admit it or not, right? Like if the moon is having this massive impact on the tides and we are so much water and our menstrual blood is, the water of our womb, of course the moon is going to be massively impactful. So you would look at the moon phase, and the new moon would be when you'd quote unquote have your period. And so you'd go inward. You would do the things like meditate and journal and spend time alone, resting more often, creating those, chopping block lists of the things that you think are really going to work and the things that you don't want to focus on for the next cycle. As the moon grows from its dark new moon phase to its bright full moon phase, that would be when inner spring would come into play because the moon's getting brighter, its energy is rising, and then your energy would be rising as well. Full moon is inner summer, the ovulation. And there's actually some evidence to suggest that, thousands and thousands of years ago when we were in our ancient ancestors, they probably ovulated at the full moon because you could see to have sex. And it was also when the earth is seen to be more fertile. So as the moon goes from its bright full moon phase back to the darkness of the new moon, that would be your inner fall. That would be when you would do the things that you were experiencing during your actual inner fall of your cycle. And so this is also the tip that I give people on birth control, because if you're on birth control, you're not having a menstrual cycle. If you're pregnant, you can sync with the moon. If you're breastfeeding, you can sync with the moon. And if you're someone who has hormonal imbalances like PCOS and you find that you're not having a regular cycle, just becoming aware of the moon can really help you unlock, a deeper reverence for the cycle, for the fact that you don't have to be, adhering to the hustle culture that is male hormones. And you can more deeply sink into your feminine. So 100% it's the moon. And when I came off of the pill, that's what I did, because I didn't have a cycle that really came back for about 7 or 8 months. I started moon bathing. I started looking at the moon. I'm a witch, so I'm very into crystals and all things moon, but I would make sure that I was doing something to at least look up at the night sky and give thanks to, the earth for holding us and the moon for shining down on us.
Right. And a lot of ancient cultures, the moon guided a lot of what they did,
Yeah.
how they traveled, what they ate. And they taught that also, they showed, even in today's society, but back then, like, women menstruated usually all together at the same time, their cycles. And they've even shown now with some studies that if women live in, I don't want to use the word tribe because that's not, but in a tribe, what I mean is like a community. So like girls in dorms, women that are roommates, or that are living in a lot of times their cycles will align with each other. And it's really is just, if anyone is interested in this, it's the more you learn about certain things. And this is something that's natural. This has been happening to women since the dawn of time. And so there is a lot of taboo about it. And I was fortunate that my menstrual cycle growing up was not a problem for me. It was not an issue. It was not painful. I wasn't, didn't get awful headaches. I didn't feel sick. I had a light flow. I was okay with that. So I didn't have that. Some women really have a very difficult time with it and their whole life. I mean, it's very challenging. I went through menopause very early, and that, I will tell you, people, is like no joke. I think it's the universe's way that was kind of like, I joke about this. They're like, oh, you had it really easy for 42 years. So now we're going to throw this rock at you and be like, here, let's go ahead and figure this out. But it's almost like you have to take another book that's like, what's happening to my body 2.0, because it's definitely bizarre. Again, you're like, oh my gosh, what is happening all over? So I love that you talked about the moon, because that is something that everyone can see, everyone can learn about. You can actually, if you're like, oh, well, what do I know? Just Google it. Lunar cycle, and when is the next new moon? And you can go from there. So I think that's really fascinating. I'm curious to hear a little bit about how you combine microdosing with part of your, like, what you do, and how that was able to, whether, I don't want to use the word, this is what happens in menopause. You can't think of English vocabulary. And so I feel awful when I'm interviewing, because I'm like, what is that word? I don't want to say enhance or facilitate, but I'm like, how do you use it together with what you currently practice?
So when I started to really study plant medicine and psilocybin specifically, I started to understand that, and I had this epiphany a couple of months ago, that women, I believe, can benefit most from microdosing because of a couple key things. The fact that we are more often to be diagnosed with things like anxiety, depression, PTSD, and burnout. The fact that we have cyclical pain, right? PMS and PMDD. There are some amazing studies showing that psilocybin can help with those things, as well as migraines, which, like you mentioned, are often something people have during their cycles. And then the last thing was the fact that, women's happiness over the last couple of decades is decreasing. Even though we've made strides in the workplace and we're, entrepreneurs and all of these things, certainly since the pandemic, like when you look at happiness overall, it's gone down. And so I started thinking of those key elements of, what a woman's life is often like, and also what psilocybin has helped me with. When I was going through anxiety and depression and burnout and PTSD last year, my microdosing practice held me through some of the toughest parts of my life. And so, as I was doing my research into a bunch of different types of protocols, and so a protocol is just the schedule that you choose to take your microdose in. There are some out there that are amazing, right? And there's, you know, all of this information on the internet you can very easily Google, but like the big heavy hitters in the psychedelic renaissance that we've had, we're in like the third renaissance now. But people like Fadiman and Stamets, they came up with these protocols that I started to look at and think, okay, if I look at where cycles are most challenging, the second half is often most challenging for a lot of people. That's when you've got the inner critic coming out. That's when you feel more feelings of loneliness and anxiety and depression. Well, this protocol, which says you're going to take the medicine for 3 days and then be off for 2 days and then take it for 3 days, that seems like that would really be helpful during the second half of your cycle. And then in the first half of the cycle, and I should say, this is an experiment I've run on myself. Like I'm the guinea pig on this. So this is my experience. The first half of my cycle, when I really wanted to be focused on creativity and flow, this other protocol seems really great. You're taking the medicine 1 day, off for 2 days, take it again, off for 2 days. So for me, cyclical microdosing is kind of what I call it. And it is a cycle informed protocol that is specific to you. Now, I've worked with people who flip it. Maybe they have more struggles in the first half of their cycle versus the second. So they want support from the medicine for more days in a row. And so that's sort of how I'm marrying the two. And as far as womb connection, what's been so fascinating for me is that in the big journeys I've had with psilocybin, where I've taken more than a microdose and I meditate or I go on a visioning quest, I go up in my womb and shit gets wild. Like I'm able to sink into that space, to descend into that awareness and uncover things like, oh, wait, that's where that weird trigger comes from. That's where that trauma comes from. And when you understand the way the womb works, we store a lot of shit in the womb because of the fact that it's the pelvic bowl, right? It's like the energetic junk drawer for all of the shit that we don't want to look at. And so for me, just psilocybin and the mycelium itself felt like it really came from the cosmic womb to help me reconnect with mine. And so that's kind of how I'm marrying the three things together to really help people become more conscious. What I've found is that people either come to me because they want to learn about their cycle and they're like a little interested in psychedelics, or vice versa.
Mhm.
They want to learn about psychedelics and then they also have a period. So it's like very natural to just think, okay, well, where are you in your cycle? What might be best for you? But I will say the biggest lesson I've learned since starting this whole journey in 2019 is to listen to my intuition. And for me, my intuition is in my womb. Like a lot of people say, listen to your gut. I listen to my womb. And so that's another key element of cyclical microdosing is just listening to the intuition of your womb. Some days you're going to want to microdose and some days you're not. And that's
Mhm.
totally fine. I think that's really the key element of anything that's intentional, learning to just listen and be okay with what comes up.
Yeah. Is there a reason that you chose psilocybin over the other plant medicines that are out there and available? Because I know that there's, you know, people have different experiences with different things, and there might be a reason why somebody chooses X versus Z. So I'm just curious, is there a reason that you went with psilocybin?
I am definitely interested in ayahuasca, but it just has not come into my awareness yet. Well, it has recently, and I may do a ceremony sometime this year. But I live kind of in the middle of nowhere in Texas, and so like a lot of things aren't available. LSD, with the current issues with drugs in general and like fentanyl, I was just more worried about anything that wasn't coming straight from Mother Earth. So that's really why I chose mushrooms and psilocybin. And I think because of my upbringing where I was terrified, like all drugs were bad, when I was growing up, that whole reefer madness bullshit, like that was still very much ingrained in like my parents' generation, and then was given to me as well as a belief. And so I've had to uncover that. And for me, mushrooms was just this thing that felt very gentle. It felt very healing. And when you look at psilocybin, it's one of the safest things you can put into your body. So that's for me what's been like just the natural gateway.
Yeah. I'm just going to give like a brief little aside. People, if you're interested in this, please go search up like a professional person and get professional advice. Don't order something off the internet that you don't know, and don't try to like microdose yourself. I mean, listen, it's like anything else. They are drugs, but
Yep.
they are natural drugs. However, if somebody has, and again, I'm a big believer in this. I've researched a lot. If you do have some people have other mental health challenges
Yes.
that may be triggered with the use of certain psychedelics. Okay. So it's really important. It's like, don't try this at home, kids, kind of thing. Like, don't play with fire and knives if you don't know what you're doing. And there's just like anything else, there's a lot of garbage out there, and there's a lot of things that are not safe. And so just go like research. There's a ton of really reputable people online now, really reputable people that have been researching this for decades.
Yep.
For decades. And, they were the research with psychedelics and LSD and psilocybin and even, ketamine. You can go down, what everyone calls MDMA. I was going to say ecstasy, what everyone calls ecstasy. So they've been researching it for decades. And then the government and the whole crackdown basically turned a lot of these into type 1 substances. And so the research basically got put to a halt. But there's really a lot of, stuff out there that is natural. Ayahuasca, peyote, psilocybin. LSD is not technically natural from the ground. It's a synthetic, as is ketamine, but ketamine technically is legal right now. So there's a lot of places that you can do ketamine. They've actually been doing, I read a study recently that was really fascinating about the use of ketamine and or MDMA in the assistance of getting people off opioids, which is a huge crisis, obviously, in our country and the world, the opioid crisis, which are drugs. They are synthetic drugs. So like, it's really just fascinating to me. There's a lot of great studies. We're going to link everything up in the show notes about you and your contact, but who are some people that you also, if the audience is like looking to like, where can they get good information? I know Tim Ferriss talks a lot about this kind of stuff on his podcast. I listen to his podcast a lot. I've read a lot of Gabor Mate and like a lot of his stuff. So who are some people that you follow that could be good people to listen to of valuable information?
Perfect. So I would first shout out my former coach, Bijou Finney. You can find her Mushroom Mamacita on Instagram. She's very much focused on like the business side of things, like helping entrepreneurs through this. And then my teachers, Access Mundi Ceremony, they make this intentional plant medicine work really accessible. They've got some really great courses that you can go and you can take. Books, oh my goddess, so many books. The one that I really love is by Michelle Janikin. I believe it's called Your Psilocybin Mushroom Companion. It's a very easy to read book, and it is very well written. I just finished reading the Psychedelic Explorer's Guide, How to Change Your Mind, Michael Pollan course, and that's a documentary, right? So you can watch
it's a
that on
great
Netflix.
book.
It's a great book.
Michael Pollan. So if you guys, honestly, if you want something really kind of interesting and fascinating and easy, there's a Netflix documentary about it right now. It's called How to Change Your Mind. Michael Pollan wrote a great book. But if you're just like a Netflix binge, and I think it gave really good information about it. Like really, he interviewed a lot of people. I thought it was anyways, good information. So
Michael Pollan's, yes, that one's very good. There's also Fantastic Fungi on Netflix as well. And I believe Stamets is in there.
Yep.
And so, yeah, I mean, these people are, like you said, like some of the heavy hitters. Microdosing Institute on Instagram is fascinating. Microdosing Guru is somebody that I was just on her podcast. She's actually done some series on Instagram where like people just share their stories about microdosing. And so it just really helps break the taboo, because kind of like you said, right? Like these are Schedule 1 drugs in a lot of places still. And while, yes, there are about a dozen states with legislation on the books right now that's hopefully going to start turning the tide, unfortunately, these have been labeled bad. And I hope that changes, right? I think that the research that we're seeing finally come out again after they've gotten the okay, even here in Texas, in 2021, there's some legislation that was able to be passed that said we could start to do some research on this. And that's great. Like, I love seeing that. But doing your own research is essential, working with someone who can help support you. And it's all about integration, right? So you can take these plant medicines and not integrate, and I don't think anything's going to change for you, right? They're not a magic pill. They will not do the work for you. I like to say that they open the door, but you have to walk through, and they'll hold your hand while you do it. But you have to do the work. And so integration really has to do with looking at what comes up, looking at the messages and the images, and implementing the wisdom into your life so that you can make massive shifts. And I think that's where the true magic is in the mushrooms, specifically for me, but psychedelics in general. It's discovering this ancient wisdom that's held within yourself that's really activated by these plant medicines.
Right. And to kind of give just like a really brief aside, if people are like, well, I don't understand psychedelic. And again, if we were grown up in the 80s where everything was taboo and it's like people are jumping off buildings when they're tripping and stuff, basically what a lot of these, and some of these psychedelics like LSD was found by accident, like how it's really interesting when you learn how things actually, they figured out this could work. I'm just going to be in a very general sense here. What we live in our conscious mind, we live in our ego, but our subconscious runs our life. The problem for most of us is that we can't tap into our subconscious because our ego and our conscious mind is all powering. And so what these medicines help to do is allow us to access our subconscious so that we can truly understand, like, especially if we're talking about PTSD and things like where we didn't truly process a trauma in our life, whether we know that trauma or don't know that trauma. So there are people that know the trauma and they can go back and recognize that and process that trauma. But there's also people that aren't consciously aware of something that happened to them, or maybe to one of their ancestors. And again, there's a lot of things. This is where it gets a little harder for people to understand, but there are things that can be generational trauma, can be passed down for a lot of reasons. But basically, in a really basic nutshell, that's what some psychedelics do. Now, I also believe, someone said this to me once, which I thought was really funny. They were like, it's like Viagra, like it'll give you a boost, but it won't make you good in bed. And I think that it's true. You have to be able to do the inner work, right? And so when they talk about psychedelics, they talk about set, setting, and dose, that you should be, in a setting that, and a lot of times they have therapists available when you're doing certain things and you're in a controlled environment. I know with MDMA and even ketamine, they'll give you, they'll take out a lot of noise and external factors. So they're really trying to control that you have a safe experience. And what happens is it's a lot of the external stimuli that can create maybe not a non-safe experience, right? And so there's a lot of information out there. And so please, if you're interested in this, first of all, you can DM me on Instagram. We're going to drop all of Leslie's contacts, but I've been fascinated about it. So I've been researching it forever. I follow Dr. Michelle Weiner, who's here in Miami. She's actually a cannabis medical professional, but she is leading research and groups on different therapeutic interventions. And so she's just really, and she's really smart. And I think it's fascinating, all the research that's out. And I do hope they can do more research again, because I think that the more research that comes out, the more people will understand and not have to fear this anymore. Okay. But again, people don't go out and buy, please research this. Let's have Leslie tell us where she can be found, reach out to her. So give us all of your information. If people want to pay you money or experience where to go, work with you or learn with you, where can they go check you out?
So the easiest thing is to find me on Instagram at Leslie Draffin. I have my own podcast called The Light Within, where I talk about this, as well as a ton of other things, and interview a bunch of amazing people. The easiest way to work with me is to sign up for a cyclical microdosing consult. It's 30 minutes. You can ask me any questions. I will be very upfront. I do not provide medicine, and I will not tell you where to get it. Like you mentioned, you're going to need to do your own research. There are a lot of companies out there, and there are places here in the States that are now really experimenting with legalizing this. So certain states like Colorado and Oregon are really at the forefront. But we can talk about questions you have, fears, you have issues with your cycle that you might want to just work on without the use of plant medicines. That's really the easiest way. And then I also offer one-on-one menstrual cycle coaching, as well as cyclical microdosing integration. And I love that you also mentioned, what they're doing in those studies, right? Where they're taking out that external stimuli. And I just wanted to add that, working with a coach or doing integration with yourself is really the only way right now that you can replicate some of the studies without being in a clinical trial. However, you can get into clinical trials. They're doing clinical trials on this. I believe the website is maps.org.
Mm-hmm.
They're doing a ton of clinical trials on this. And if that's something that fascinates you, look those up. There was one getting run out of Austin near where I live. And I'm like, that sounds cool. So replicating that safe environment in the form of working with a coach, or, if you can find a therapist who's doing this, underground, that's really what I would suggest. And then the only other thing I wanted to add to, and that's what you were mentioning, that this is a very expansive substance. And so for people who have anxiety and depression, which are very contracting types of things, that's why it can be very helpful, because it can help you get out of the head and out of those negative thought loops. But if you're someone who experiences mental health issues like schizophrenia, bipolar 1, which are very expansive and opening situations, psychedelic use is not recommended. And there are also some medicines that they are very contraindications. So MAOIs, people with heart disease or heart issues. There are certain other types of medicines as well that are not suggested to work with. Even SSRIs can actually lessen the felt effects of psychedelics. And so some people who combine them may find that they're going to take much more because they quote unquote can't feel it because of the SSRIs. So you want to talk to somebody about that as well. And then even if you do start your own microdosing protocol, understand that coffee can also impact. So you may not feel a lot when you drink coffee, or you might feel more than normal. So please just, reach out to me, reach out to someone, reach out to Krista, because it's doing these things safely that I think is really going to start to continue turning the tide, of the collective
Mhm.
response when it comes to this. The people who, like you mentioned, were jumping off of the buildings because they were having these terrible trips. I think that it was the response to those people's, and also the response to people who were having bad trips that then landed them in psychedelic hospitals for like the rest of their life. The response by the outside world, telling people, oh, something bad's happening. Like, if we can come and believe this is just an act and a love consciousness, like a heart opening consciousness, I think that it will help get rid of a lot of the fear, and hopefully turn the tide of the legalization.
Yes, hopefully.
Fingers
I mean,
crossed.
I hope to see it in our lifetime, because there really can be, there's a lot of things out there that research has shown this could help. But
Mhm.
like Leslie said, bipolar 1 disorder, schizophrenia is definitely not indicated for psychedelic use. Um, it can send you seriously into a manic state, which is what they fear. So it is important that you consult a professional, please. I am not a professional. I could, I would probably say go call Leslie. But if you're interested in like books and stuff like that, like I have a plethora of them, but please, again, don't try this at home, right? Like, kind of thing. But it is very successful. And you could go down the rabbit hole with me too. We can do all of that stuff. It's fascinating. So we're going to link up all in the show notes where you can find her, but at Leslie Draffin over on Instagram. Go check her out on Instagram, follow her, and maybe shoot her a DM, let her know you heard her on
Yeah.
the Female Empowered podcast. It's been really fascinating to chat with you, and I am excited for the future of hopefully plant-based medicine, as well as more women learning to, and men for that reason, understanding to learn cycles and how we can integrate that into the betterment of our life. I think it's fascinating. So thanks so much, Leslie, for coming on today. And everyone else, I hope you have a good one, and take care, ladies. Bye for now.